I want you to picture me sitting in that empty church, the candles at the altar still warm, the smell of wax and wood polish settling into my clothes, and I want you to understand that I was not crying. I had moved past crying. What I felt was something colder and quieter than grief. Something that had been building for 41 years and had finally, on a Tuesday evening in January, found its shape. I am 75 years old. My name is on a legal document that froze $68 million. And the man who spent decades telling me I was too simple to understand complicated things had just said so on national television, in front of approximately 4 million viewers, with his mistress smiling beside him like a woman who had already won. He had not won. Neither had she. But they did not know that yet. Let me take you back. Let me take you to where it actually started, because nothing that comes apart does so all at once. It happens in layers, the way brick row houses in this working-class neighborhood of Oak Park show their age slowly, one crumbling mortar joint at a time. Oak Park in January is the kind of cold that gets into your thinking, the kind that keeps you inside for days, that makes the windows of your apartment in an old brick building with a fire escape fog up from the warmth you cook into the air. I had made banana pudding that evening, layered with vanilla wafers, the same recipe I have been making since 1974, and I had left it on the counter untouched because what was supposed to be a special day had turned into something I did not have words for yet. I was wearing my turquoise blouse, the one I save for special occasions, the one that makes my granddaughter say, "Grandma, you look like the sky." I had put it on that morning with intention, smoothing it down in front of the mirror where my rosary beads hang from one corner, catching the pale winter light. I had whispered a prayer the way I always do before I leave the apartment, a small private conversation between me and God that I have been having since I was a girl in this same kind of neighborhood, with the same kind of cold pressing against the glass. I walked into that church after the evening service, when the congregation had filed out and the ushers were turning off the overhead lights one by one, and I slid into the back pew and just sat there. The silence was not empty. It was full of something I was still trying to name, because earlier that afternoon, on a television in the church hall where we had gathered for the Women's Fellowship meeting, someone had turned up the volume on a cable news segment, and there he was, my ex-husband of 41 years, seated at a glossy anchor desk beside a woman I had heard whispered about for years but never confronted, because I had trained myself not to confront. He was wearing the charcoal suit he saves for important appearances. He looked relaxed, confident, like a man who has never once been accountable for anything. The host, a young woman with kind eyes, asked him about the early years, about who had been beside him when he was building. There was a pause, the kind of pause a man takes when he is deciding how much cruelty to portion out. And then he leaned forward into the microphone and said it. 11 words, casual, almost bored. She was never smart enough to understand what I was building anyway. I felt the room tilt. I heard someone gasp, maybe me, maybe the woman beside me, maybe all of us together. Because those 11 words contained 41 years of a specific kind of damage. 41 years of him saying it quietly, privately, in rooms I could not leave. And now he had said it out loud, to millions. And then I touched the wedding ring on my finger, worn so thin you can barely read the inscription inside the band. The word always ground down to almost nothing. And something in me went very, very still. I did not panic. I did not weep. I thought, he does not know. He does not know about the freeze. He does not know what I found. He does not know that the $68 million he built using my name and my signature and my unknowing trust has been legally, cleanly, completely locked. He went on television to humiliate me, and he walked into a trap he had built himself. If what I just said made your jaw drop, I understand. Stay with me. Because the way we got there, from that woman in the back pew touching a thinning ring, is a story that belongs to more people than just me. And I need you to hear all of it. The candles at the altar were still warm when I finally stood up, smoothed my turquoise blouse, picked up my purse, and walked out into the cold. Outside, Oak Park was quiet. The brick row houses on the familiar street throwing long shadows across snow that had not been shoveled yet, the small porches dark, the neighborhood tucked into itself against the winter dark. I looked up at the sky, and I thought about who I used to be before I forgot. Then I thought about what I was going to do next. I need you to keep listening, because what happened next is the part no one expected, least of all him. People ask me when I knew something was wrong, and I always pause before I answer, because the honest answer is, I knew from the beginning. I just did not trust what I knew. That is the whole architecture of it, you see. It is not that the woman being gaslit is foolish. It is that she is systematically taught to distrust her own intelligence. And when you pair that with a woman like me, a woman who was raised to believe that forgiveness is not a choice, but an obligation, that blood and family must always be forgiven, that love means staying even when staying costs you, you have the perfect conditions for a very long, very quiet devastation. He started slowly. In the early years, it was small things. I would remember a conversation a certain way, and he would shake his head with that patient, tired expression and say I was confused. I would notice a number that did not add up in the household accounts, and he would sigh, that particular sigh of a man performing exhausted tolerance, and explain that the finances were complicated and that I should not worry myself. He never said I was stupid outright. He was too skilled for that. He said it sideways. He said it through implications and through the specific texture of his patience, which always carried the subtext. I am explaining this to you because you cannot be expected to understand on your own. And here is the part that still costs me sleep sometimes. I believed him. Not because I was weak, not because I was uneducated. I believed him because I come from people who stayed. My mother stayed. My grandmother stayed. The women in this working-class neighborhood with brick row houses and small porches stayed in their marriages and called it strength, called it faithfulness, called it what love actually looked like when you stripped away the romance and got down to the daily work of it. I had absorbed that lesson until it lived in my bones. Forgiveness was not something I chose consciously. It was something I was. It was the architecture of how I understood myself. And so every time he deflected, I forgave. Every time he made me feel small, I told myself that patience was a virtue. Every time he dismissed what I clearly saw with my own eyes, I reached for my rosary beads, the ones hanging from the bedroom mirror, cool and smooth under my fingers. And I prayed for the grace to be a better wife, a more understanding wife, a less difficult wife. I gave up myself in increments so small I did not notice until the woman I had been was entirely gone. I used to play dominoes every Thursday evening with a group of women from church, loud, funny, sharp women who would argue over scores and then laugh until they cried. I used to look forward to Thursdays the way a person looks forward to breathing. Somewhere around our 15th year of marriage, I stopped going. He did not forbid it exactly. He just needed me at home on Thursdays. He was expecting a call. He had a headache. The drive was too much for one car. After a while, I stopped waiting to be needed and just stopped going. I told myself I would go back when things settled. Things never settled. And I forgot, slowly and completely, that I had ever been the woman who laughed until she cried over a game of dominoes. In winters like that one, Oak Park winters that close in around you, the windows of my apartment fogging from the warmth of the kitchen, I would cook to feel something. Banana pudding layered with vanilla wafers, chicken and rice, biscuits in the cast-iron skillet. The kitchen was the one place the gaslighting could not reach me, because no one could tell me I had not made what I had clearly made, that I had not added the vanilla extract I was holding in my own hand. In the kitchen, I still trusted myself. Those small moments of self-trust were the embers he never quite managed to put out. I want to speak to you for a second directly, because if you are listening to this and something is pulling at you, some recognition, I need you to hear me. Gaslighting does not feel like abuse while it is happening. It feels like confusion. It feels like your own failure. It feels like you are the problem in the room that everyone is too kind to name. That feeling? That is not a personal failing. That is a strategy being used against you. Name it. Write it down. Tell someone. Back to the story. The seeds of what would eventually destroy everything were always visible if I had been allowed to trust my vision. I noticed that he took calls in the garage. I noticed that certain accounts he mentioned in conversations were never mentioned again. I noticed that his business partner, Gerald, a steady, gruff man who had been cordial to me for years, began to avoid my eyes at gatherings around year 22 of the marriage. I noticed that there were documents that arrived in the mail that were quickly claimed before I could open them, conversations that stopped when I walked into rooms, a specific tension that lived in the space between us that he insisted was my imagination. I noticed all of it, and every time I noticed, he explained it away with the patient exhaustion of a man performing a service he had long ceased to enjoy. He was right about one thing. The finances were complicated. What he was wrong about, catastrophically, expensively, legally wrong about, was the idea that complicated meant beyond me. The day I stopped fully believing him was the day a junior accountant named Delia knocked on my door. But that comes later. Before Delia, before the folder, before everything, there was one more night of me sitting in my apartment in the old brick building with the fire escape, watching the snow fall on Oak Park, touching the thinning wedding ring, and wondering why I felt like a stranger in my own life. That was the last night I spent wondering. When the grief is deep enough, it eventually burns through its own floor. What you find underneath is not peace. It is not acceptance. It is something harder and more useful than both. Focus. I stopped crying on a Wednesday. I remember it specifically because I had the television on in the background and the weather report said another 4 inches by morning, and I thought, I do not have time for 4 more inches. I did not mean the snow. Delia had come to my door the previous Tuesday. She was young, late 20s, coat still wet from the sleet, and she handed me a folder without preamble, the way people hand you something they have been holding for too long and finally need to set down. She said she had been watching the accounts for 3 years. She said she had found me through my daughter. She said she was sorry and that she meant it, and I believed her because her hands were shaking. Inside that folder was the structure of 40 years of my own erasure. Account transfers I had never authorized, but whose authorization bore my signature. Shell company registrations that listed me as co-owner of entities I had never heard named. And one document, dated 2003, notarized, completely legal, that established me as the primary fiduciary co-owner of a holding trust. At the time of its creation, that trust was worth $31 million. By the time Delia placed it in my hands, it had grown to $68 million. My name, my signature, my legal identity. Used for 2 decades as the foundation of an empire he had told me was too complicated for me to understand. I sat at my kitchen table with that folder open, and I did not move for a long time. I want to be honest with you. I did not immediately feel outrage. What I felt first was something almost like recognition. The deep, terrible recognition of a woman who always knew something was wrong and is now holding the evidence that she was right. There is a specific grief in that, in discovering that your instincts were never broken, that you were. The collapse came later that night. I had been flipping through the documents one more time when a photograph fell from the back of the folder. Not a document, a photocopy of my old driver's license. From 1989. I was 38 years old in that photograph. My hair was different. My eyes were direct and bright and looking straight at the camera with an expression I could only describe as undefeated. I stared at that photocopy for a full minute without recognizing myself. A full minute. Then something cracked open in my chest. I sat down on the kitchen floor of my apartment in that old brick building with the fire escape, and I cried the way you cry when you are not performing grief for anyone. Ugly, total, from somewhere below the ribs. The banana pudding I had made sat on the counter untouched. The rosary beads caught the kitchen light from across the hallway where I could see the bedroom mirror. I did not reach for them. I just let myself be a 75-year-old woman sitting on a cold linoleum floor holding a photograph of herself from before she forgot who she was. I stayed on that floor as long as I needed to. And then I got up. I want you to feel that transition because it is the whole story in miniature. The getting up. There is a moment in every woman's journey through this kind of devastation where the floor becomes a choice. You can stay on it, and no one would blame you. Or you can get up, and everything that comes after flows from that decision. I chose to get up. The wedding ring was on the table where I had placed it when I sat down. I looked at it, worn so thin you can barely read the inscription, the word always nearly invisible now, ground away by 41 years of continuous contact with my skin. I left it on the table. I opened the folder again, and this time I read it like a woman who knew exactly what she was looking at. I made a list. I am 75 years old, and I have kept a paper planner since 1981, and I wrote down every question I needed answered, every document I needed copied, every account I needed traced. My handwriting was steady. My hands did not shake. I think he would have found that deeply alarming if he could have seen me right then. The quiet focus of a woman who has just discovered that the legal ground beneath 40 years of a marriage was, in fact, hers. He had borrowed my name to build an empire. He had counted on me not knowing what that meant. He had spent 20 years reinforcing the belief that I was too confused, too simple, too forgiving to ever look closely enough to understand. What he had not counted on was Delia. He had not counted on a young woman in a wet coat with shaking hands and a conscience. And he absolutely had not counted on me. There is a specific kind of rage that comes after you have already cried yourself empty. It is not hot. It is not uncontrolled. It is cold and very, very clear. The kind of clarity you only get when the noise of grief has finally finished and what remains is pure structural truth. That was the rage I was operating on the morning Gerald called my daughter. His name was Gerald Moss. I had known him for 23 years. He had been at our 25th anniversary dinner. He had shaken my hand at every company function I had attended as the wife who stood at the edge of things, smiling, nodding, not asking complicated questions. I had always found him slightly guarded, slightly uncomfortable around me, and I had attributed it to his personality. I understand now that it was guilt. He had known. He had known for years, and he had been party to it long enough that when he finally decided to switch sides, he did so with the particular urgency of a man trying to outrun his own conscience. Gerald had been pushed out of the firm in 2018 after a dispute. The details of that dispute, I would learn later, involved Gerald objecting to how far the use of my legal identity had gone. He had not objected on moral grounds alone. He had objected because he was smart enough to understand that what they were doing would eventually surface, and he did not want to be standing in the room when it did. He had been building his own record ever since. Emails, financial summaries, and voice recordings from internal meetings where my name was discussed specifically, in terms of how to ensure I never discovered my own legal standing. My daughter brought me to meet him at a diner on a Sunday morning. Snow still on the ground, the Oak Park streets quiet the way they get in deep winter. Gerald was already there when we arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a briefcase on the seat beside him, drinking black coffee, looking like a man who had not slept well in a long time. He slid a USB drive across the table before he even said hello. I want to tell you what was on that drive, because I know you want to know. There were 47 internal voice recordings. In one of them, a meeting from 2019, my ex-husband's voice is unmistakable, discussing the trust structure, discussing my signature, discussing what would happen if she ever woke up and started asking real questions. Those exact words, if she ever woke up. I sat in that diner booth with my hands folded on the table, listening to my daughter describe what she had already heard, and I thought, I am awake now. Gerald said. "I should have come to you sooner. I know that doesn't fix anything." I told him that no, it didn't fix anything, but that I appreciated him coming at all. There was nothing else to say to him about the past. What mattered now was the present and the future, and what the law had to say about all of it. Do you understand what I am describing? Do you feel the shift? Because if you have ever been the person in the room who was told not to worry, not to ask, not to look too closely, and then found out that your trust was the very instrument being used against you, you know what that shift feels like. It does not feel like victory yet. It feels like the moment before a door opens. My daughter had already found a financial attorney named Patricia before the meeting with Gerald. Patricia came recommended by a woman at my church who had gone through her own version of this, quietly, several years earlier. Patricia was in her 50s, precise and unhurried in the way of someone who has learned to move carefully through complicated spaces. She did not waste language. When I sat down in her office, a clean, spare room in a building on Michigan Avenue with a view of the city gray and cold under January sky, she listened to everything I had to say. Then she looked at the folder Delia had brought me and said 3 words. "This is winnable." That was all I needed. I want to pause here and speak to anyone who is listening and thinking about their own situation, their own folder, their own list of things they noticed and were told not to trust. Help comes. Sometimes it comes from unexpected places. Sometimes it comes from the person you least expected to knock on your door in a wet coat. Sometimes it comes from the man who was on the wrong side and finally decided he did not want to be anymore. But it comes. The question is whether you are ready to receive it. I was ready. I had been ready, I think, since 1989. Since the woman in that photograph was standing somewhere with a grin that said she would make it through. Patricia's team began with the trust documents. Then the account transfers. Then the shell companies. 6 weeks of forensic accounting that mapped every transaction that had touched my legal identity without my informed consent. Every dollar, every signature, every notarized blessing I had given without understanding what I was blessing. When Patricia laid the completed case in front of me, she said, "We can freeze the assets, all of them, clean and legal and airtight." She looked at me directly and added, "He will not see it coming." I nodded. And then I said something I had not said in 41 years of marriage, something I had been trained out of saying, something that felt like muscle memory from a version of myself I had almost entirely lost. I said, "Good. There is a particular skill set required to function normally when your entire inner life has been reconfigured around a single purpose. Actors understand it. Surgeons understand it. Women who have been told for decades that they are too simple to understand the complicated things, and who have finally decided to prove otherwise, understand it perhaps best of all. For 6 weeks, I was the most serene woman in Oak Park. I went to church on Sundays. I made my banana pudding for the Women's Fellowship potluck and accepted the compliments on the layering of the vanilla wafers with a smile I had been perfecting since the Eisenhower administration. I returned phone calls. I waved to my neighbor on the 2nd floor. I did all the quiet, ordinary things that constitute a 75-year-old woman's life in a working-class neighborhood with brick row houses and small porches, and I did them with such absolute normalcy that I sometimes frightened myself. Inside, I was a woman at war. Patricia and her team were working. Gerald was cooperating fully, providing whatever documentation was requested, answering questions with the speed of a man eager to reduce his own legal exposure. Delia had signed a formal statement. The forensic accountants had completed their mapping of the trust structure. The legal framework was nearly complete. We were 3 days from filing the asset freeze when something happened that almost ended everything. He called me. I was standing in my kitchen when my cell phone rang, his number. I had not heard from him in 8 months, not since the divorce had been finalized, not since the settlement that I had accepted without a fight because I did not yet know what I was owed. I picked up on the 3rd ring because answering on the 1st would have told him something. "I've been thinking about you," he said. the voice of a man who has never once doubted his ability to manage a situation. I heard some things about questions being asked. I want to make sure you're doing all right. I want you to understand what that sentence meant. What he was actually saying, stripped of its concern-shaped packaging, was, I know someone is sniffing around. I want to know if it's you. And I am calling to find out whether you are still the woman I can manage. I held the phone for 2 full seconds. Then I said, in the same mild, slightly confused tone I had deployed for decades, Oh, I don't know much about any of that. You know how I get with complicated things. A pause. Are you eating well? You always forgot to eat when you got anxious. He laughed, short, relieved. You're fine, he said. It was not a question. He was confirming what he needed to believe. I'm always fine, I said. You know me. We hung up. I set the phone down on the counter very carefully, the way you set down something that could shatter. Then I called Patricia and told her about the call. She said, Can you hold 3 more days? I said, I have been holding for 41 years. She said, 3 days then. That was the moment, that exact conversation in that exact kitchen, where I understood that saying no does not always sound like a shout. Sometimes it sounds like a mild-voiced woman talking about eating habits while dismantling an empire on the other line. I said no to him in that moment, and he did not even know it. I said no to being managed, no to being assessed, no to being the woman he had spent decades constructing out of my silence and my forgiveness. I said it out loud, no, and I meant every syllable of it, even wrapped in 41 years of practiced docility. My daughter was the one who drove me to Patricia's office on the filing day. We did not speak much in the car. Outside the window, Oak Park slid past, the familiar brick, the porches, the storefronts she and her brothers had grown up knowing. At a red light, she reached over and squeezed my hand. I squeezed back. That was enough. Patricia filed the freeze at 10:47 in the morning. By 2:00 p.m., it was confirmed. Every account connected to the holding trust, every shell company bearing my legal identity as co-owner, every asset built on the foundation of my unknowing cooperation, frozen. $68 million, locked, legally, cleanly, completely. He found out 3 days later when a transaction failed to clear. His attorneys contacted Patricia's office within the hour. Patricia called me and said, He knows. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the satisfaction underneath it. The satisfaction of someone who has done very careful, very good work. I was at church when she called. Not in the back pew this time, but up front, at the Thursday domino game that I had recently, quietly, resumed. The women around the table looked up when I answered my phone. I listened. I said thank you. I hung up. Good news? One of the women asked. I set my domino tile down. The very best, I said. He could have handled it quietly. That was always an option available to him. He could have contacted Patricia, worked through channels, negotiated a resolution that kept the scope of what he had done away from public view. His attorneys advised this. I know, because his lead attorney told Patricia as much in a follow-up call, that his client was open to a private resolution and hoped to handle this with discretion, out of respect for all parties involved. He did not choose this. His pride did not allow it, and so instead he chose television. Whether the television appearance was planned before he knew about the freeze, or whether it was a miscalculation made in the frantic days after, I do not know precisely. What I know is that by the time he sat down in that studio chair with his mistress beside him, he genuinely believed, that the story he was telling, the story in which I was the footnote he could dismiss with 11 words, was still his to control. He believed that because he had always controlled it. He had controlled the narrative of our marriage, our finances, our family's understanding of who was capable and who was not, for 4 decades. The habit of control is not easily surrendered. So he went on television and said what he said. And the $68 million sat frozen, waiting, like a trap he had built himself and walked into, smiling. Patricia had already scheduled the confrontation for 3 days after the broadcast. We chose the location deliberately, the restaurant where we had celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary. The same booth if possible, she said, and I had almost laughed. Almost. His attorneys had agreed to a mediation meeting without being told who else would be present. They thought it would be 2 legal teams and a private mediator. What they did not know was that 47 journalists had been notified to wait outside. Gerald had made some calls. My daughter had made some calls. Patricia, it turned out, had made several calls. I spent the night before the confrontation in my apartment in the old brick building. The fire escape outside my kitchen window was crusted with ice from an overnight freeze that had taken the temperature down hard. I stood at the window for a while and watched the street. Oak Park was dark and quiet. The brick row houses settled into themselves against the cold. I thought about the 25th anniversary dinner, how I had worn a dress I no longer owned, how he had ordered for me without asking, how I had looked around the restaurant and thought we had built something. We had. He had just made sure it was built in my name. On the morning of the confrontation, I put on my turquoise blouse. I stood in front of the bedroom mirror and looked at myself. 75 years old, white-haired, upright. And then I looked at the rosary beads hanging from the corner of the frame, the way they catch the light. I said one prayer, not for strength. I had the strength. I prayed for clarity, for the right words in the right order when the moment came. My daughter drove me. As we pulled into the restaurant's parking lot, I saw it, parked 3 spaces from the entrance, impossibly clean against the gray Chicago morning. A Mercedes-Benz S-Class in pearl white. His, of course. The man had always understood the language of display, the importance of arriving in something that communicated exactly how he thought of himself. I looked at that car for a moment through the window of my daughter's practical, salt-stained SUV. I thought about what my name was worth. I thought about what I now knew my name was worth. I thought, a woman who knows that can afford to drive whatever she chooses, or nothing at all, and both choices carry the same weight. I got out of the car. I walked toward the entrance. My heels on the frozen concrete made a very specific sound, deliberate, unhurried, each step exactly where I intended it to be. Inside, Patricia was already seated. Gerald was at a separate table near the window, present as a witness. The mediator sat at the head. His legal team was there, 3 attorneys in expensive suits who looked collectively like a wall that expected to hold. And then there was him. At the booth. Our booth. Looking exactly like the man on television who had dismissed me to 2. 4 million viewers. He saw me walk in. Something moved across his face. Not quite fear, not quite recognition, but something in between. Something that told me he was only now beginning to understand what had been assembled around him. I sat down across the table from him. I straightened my turquoise blouse. I folded my hands. And I waited. The restaurant was warm the way old Chicago establishments always are in winter. The kind of warmth that comes from the building itself, from decades of cooked meals and muffled conversations absorbed into the walls. The lunch crowd had not yet arrived. Our booth was in a corner, and from where I sat, I could see the front window and, beyond it, the gray street where 47 journalists were arranged in a patience they were working hard to maintain. His lead attorney opened with a statement about his client's willingness to explore a negotiated resolution. The words were smooth and careful and engineered to sound reasonable. Patricia let him finish. Then she opened her folder and placed the asset freeze documentation on the center of the table like a hand of cards laid face up. Your client built $68 million on the legal foundation of my client's identity, she said. Every dollar traceable, every signature verified, every company bearing her name as primary co-owner, legally established as such with her unwitting participation documented in your client's own internal communications. She set Gerald's USB recordings beside the documents. We also have audio. The silence that followed had texture. I could hear someone at the bar section of the restaurant rinsing glasses. He looked at me. For the first time in perhaps a decade, he looked at me the way you look at a person You are actually seeing, not the person you have constructed, not the simplified version you have managed, but the actual woman sitting across from you in a turquoise blouse with 41 years of clear-eyed attention behind her eyes. He said my name, just my name, the way a man says something he thought he had already put away safely. I let it sit in the air between us for a moment. Then I said, "You spent 40 years telling me I wasn't smart enough to understand what you were building. It turns out I only needed 1 year to freeze all of it." I watched his jaw tighten. I watched his attorneys exchange a look that communicated everything they would not say aloud. "You borrowed my identity to build an empire," I said. My voice was level. I had not raised it. I did not need to raise it. The quieter I spoke, the more the room leaned in. "The law says I am owed half of what it became. Sign the settlement agreement, or I will walk outside to those journalists and explain to their cameras and their viewers, some of whom watched you on television 3 days ago dismissing the woman who made all of this legally possible, exactly why you won't." One of his attorneys started to speak. Patricia held up one finger and the attorney stopped. He looked at the documents. He looked at the recordings. He looked at me. Here is what I want you to understand about that moment. I felt nothing. Not triumph. Not yet. Not anger. Not the compressed grief of 41 years. What I felt was something much simpler and much more powerful than any of those things. I felt correct. I felt the settled, clean sensation of a woman who finally and completely trusts what she knows. "You always needed an audience," I said. "You needed one when you said what you said on television. You have one now. The difference is that this time you don't control what the audience hears." His face, I will describe it to you because you deserve to see it. He had the expression of a man whose map of the world has just been proven wrong. Not embarrassed exactly, not ashamed. I am not sure he was capable of shame in that booth, in that moment. It was something closer to bewilderment. The specific bewilderment of someone who built a 40-year strategy on a single miscalculation. The belief that I would always stay on the kitchen floor. I thought. I got up. He signed. He signed the preliminary framework on the table in front of his 3 attorneys, and a mediator, and God, and Gerald, and Patricia, and 47 journalists outside in the cold. His hand moved across the paper, and when he set the pen down, something finished. Not everything. The legal process would continue for months, documentation and verification, and the slow, careful work of dismantling and redistributing. But something essential finished in that moment. I stood up. I straightened my blouse. Patricia gathered the documents. I looked at him one more time, and I made a decision I had been practicing without knowing it for 75 years. I chose not to say anything else. Some silences carry more weight than any closing line. Some truths are complete without punctuation. I walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard his lead attorney say something in a low voice. I heard Patricia respond. I pushed open the restaurant door and stepped out into the January cold of Oak Park, and the 47 journalists turned toward me like sunflowers, and I walked through them with my daughter at my shoulder and my turquoise blouse catching what little winter light there was. And I said nothing except, "The documentation speaks for itself. Thank you." Some victories do not need to be performed. They simply need to be lived. The story broke before we reached the parking lot. I could hear it beginning, phones and notifications and the specific hum of a thing being transmitted outward to the world. By the time my daughter unlocked her car, the segment from 3 days ago was already being replayed alongside the new footage, the before and after of what he had said about me and what I had just done about it. I sat in the passenger seat and closed my eyes for exactly 30 seconds. Then I opened them, and we drove back through Oak Park, past the brick row houses and the small porches and the neighborhood that had held all of us. And I started thinking about what came next. Justice does not arrive the way you imagine it will. You spend months, years, sometimes picturing it as a single definitive moment, a door slamming, a verdict read aloud, a face falling at the precise angle that tells you the account is settled. And then it comes, and it is not a single moment at all. It is a series of quieter things, an account statement, a legal notification, a phone call from Patricia saying that his board had voted, effective immediately, to remove him from his own firm. A brief item in a business publication about the dissolution of 3 shell companies. A short statement from his former mistress, released through a publicist, describing him as someone she no longer had a relationship with. A statement that managed to distance itself from him with the efficiency of someone who had read the financial news that morning and made a very quick calculation. The board removal happened within 2 weeks of the confrontation. His firm, which bore his name, began operating under restructured management and then, 6 months later, quietly merged with a larger entity that kept none of his branding. 3 sponsors pulled their funding from the cable network segment within 72 hours of the broadcast clip circulating alongside our documentation. The network itself issued a statement about the segment being under editorial review, the particular language organizations use when they want to suggest accountability without admitting what they allowed. His reputation, which he had spent 4 decades constructing as carefully as any financial instrument, did not collapse dramatically. It deflated. Steadily, specifically, in the way that things deflate when the air that was holding them up turns out to have been borrowed. Patricia called me on a Thursday morning to tell me the final settlement had been signed and certified. I was at the domino table in the church hall when my phone rang. The same women who had looked up when I answered the call 6 weeks earlier looked up again now. I listened. I said thank you. I hung up. "Same good news?" one of the women asked. "The conclusion of it," I said. I set down a tile and won the hand. The wedding ring, the one worn so thin you can barely read the inscription, the word always reduced to a shadow of itself. I put it away the morning after the settlement was confirmed. I did not throw it away. I am 75 years old, and I understand that objects carry more than sentiment. They carry testimony. I placed it in a small box on the shelf above my desk, where I can see it when I write. It is there to remind me, not of him, but of her, the woman who wore it for 41 years and kept her eyes open even when she was told to close them. Patricia came to the apartment for coffee the week after. We sat in the kitchen, my kitchen in the old brick building, the fire escape outside now starting its slow spring thaw, and she asked me what I was going to do next. I told her I was writing. I had been writing since the night Delia brought the folder. At first it was just notes, dates, names, documentation of what I remembered and when. But somewhere in those weeks of focused clarity, the notes had become something else. Pages, chapters. A woman's account of 40 years of careful erasure and 1 year of equally careful recovery. A memoir. That is what they call it when a person writes the truth of their own life from the inside out. I have also begun a workshop. It started in the church hall with 8 women from this working-class neighborhood with brick row houses and small porches. Women who came because a friend told them, or because they saw the news coverage, or because they themselves were sitting on a kitchen floor and needed to know someone had gotten up. Now it runs twice a month, and we have expanded to a community center 3 miles from my old apartment. But I do not live in that apartment anymore. My final destination was always clear to me once I permitted myself to think clearly: the city where my grandchildren live. I moved there in the early spring, to a house with a real yard and a porch of my own, the kind of porch where you can sit in the morning and watch the neighborhood come awake. My granddaughter is 11, and she has decided to learn dominoes. My grandson is 8, and he likes to sit beside me while I write, doing his homework, both of us working in companionable silence at the kitchen table. I cook banana pudding for them on Fridays. They eat it straight from the dish with no regard for the effort it represents, the way children eat things they love, completely and without self-consciousness. My rosary beads hang from the mirror in my new bedroom. I still say my morning prayer, but I have stopped praying for the grace to be more understanding. I pray instead for clarity and for courage, and for the good sense to know my own legal standing. Gerald sent a card when the settlement finalized. He did not explain himself further. He did not need to. I sent him a brief note that said, "I hope you're sleeping better." I meant it without irony. Patricia is on retainer, not because I anticipate needing her again, but because I learned, at 75 years old, that having a financial attorney's number in your phone is not pessimism. It is infrastructure. I drove past the Mediators building last month, passing through on my way to see a friend from church who had moved to the city 3 years ago. I did not see the Mercedes-Benz S-Class in pearl white in the lot. I looked for it, I admit. It was not there. And I drove on, in my own car, on my own terms, toward my own life. Spring came to my new city in the way it does after a hard winter. Not all at once, but in increments, the cold releasing its grip 1 degree at a time until one morning you step onto your porch and the air has changed and you realize, mid-breath, that the season has turned. Oak Park winters close in around you. Where I live now, spring arrives like a decision being made. I have had time to think. That is perhaps the most underestimated gift of the whole ordeal. Time. Not the time I lost, 41 years of it, carefully and deliberately taken from me. But the time I have now, in which I am the one who decides how it is spent. I think about the woman in the 1989 photograph often. Not with grief anymore. With something closer to reunion. She was there all along, waiting under the layers of a carefully managed confusion, with her direct eyes and her decided grin, certain she would make it through. She was right. I have been working on the memoir steadily. Chapter after chapter. Morning after morning at the kitchen table while my grandson does his homework beside me, and the neighborhood outside the porch window moves through its ordinary rhythms. I am not writing it to expose him. Exposure already happened, thoroughly and publicly, without my orchestrating it. I am writing it because the woman on the church floor needed someone to have written it before her, and I did not find that book. So I am making it. The workshop runs on the second and fourth Thursday of every month. I stand in front of a room of women, some in their 30s, some in their 60s, some my age, some who drove 40 minutes to be there. And I talk about what I know. I talk about the mechanics of gaslighting, about how identity is used as a legal instrument, about the specific vulnerability of women who were raised to believe that forgiveness means silence. I talk about Delia, who knocked on a stranger's door in the rain because her conscience required it. I talk about the fact that your name on a document is power, and that someone may be counting on you not knowing that. And then I talk about the law. This is the part I consider the most important part of what I do now. Not the story of my own situation, which is particular and specific and mine, but the universal dimension of it. What the law says and how to protect yourself. Women come to me who have no idea what documents they have signed in their marriages. Women come to me who have been told, for years, that certain finances are too complicated for them. Women come to me who are still on the kitchen floor, not because they lack intelligence or courage, but because no one has yet handed them a folder and said, "Here is what is actually true." Let me say what needs to be said directly, because I have stopped softening things out of habit. The WHO estimates that nearly 16% of seniors in communities suffer abuse every year, and the vast majority of that abuse is financial, the vast majority of it perpetrated by people they trusted, and the vast majority of it entirely legal in its mechanism. A signature on a document you did not read, a power of attorney you did not fully understand, an account opened in your name for purposes you were not informed of, legal mechanism, invisible to the victim, and profoundly effective precisely because it relies on trust to operate. That statistic, 16%, means that in a room of 25 seniors, 4 of them are living in some version of what I lived. Look at that number and understand it. And studies reveal that 17% of adults had 4 or more traumatic experiences, which means that by the time many of us reach 75 years old, we have already survived things that should have finished us. We have already practiced recovering. We have already demonstrated in our own bodies and our own lives that getting up from the floor is not a one-time event. It is a practice. And the difference between the woman who stays on the floor and the woman who picks up the folder is not character. It is information. It is someone extending a hand and saying, "Here is what you are owed. Here is what the law says. Here is who you actually are when the gaslighting is stripped away." If you are listening to this and something in you is pulling, some recognition, some familiarity with the shape of what I have described, I need you to do one thing. Find out what your name is on. Find out what documents bear your signature. Do not wait for Adelia to come to your door. Find out now, while you can still act on it. Because your name is not just your identity. In the eyes of the law, it is infrastructure, and it belongs entirely to you. I still wear my turquoise blouse on special days. I still make banana pudding on Fridays. I still say my morning prayer beside the rosary beads hanging from my bedroom mirror, that small, private conversation I have been having with God since girlhood, which has never asked me to be smaller than I am. I have resumed playing dominoes with a determination that my granddaughter finds alarming and my church friends find extremely familiar. The man who said I was never smart enough to understand what he was building is no longer building anything. His board removed him, his firm dissolved. His carefully constructed public identity, the confident man in the charcoal suit, the man who arrived in a pearl-white Mercedes-Benz S-Class and expected rooms to arrange themselves around him, is now a cautionary item in business news archives and in the private conversations of people who knew him and are reassessing what they knew. He lost the fortune. He lost the status. He lost the story he had been telling about himself for 40 years. I lost 41 years. I will not pretend otherwise, and I will not dress it in language that makes it smaller than it was. That is the true cost, and it sits in me honestly. But here is what I found when I cleared the rubble. Myself, mostly intact, with my name, my intelligence, my capacity for love, my granddaughter learning dominoes on a spring morning, my grandson doing homework beside me in comfortable silence, my memoir taking shape page by page, my workshop full of women who needed someone to go first. I found the woman from the photograph. I found her here, at 75, exactly where I left her. The inscription on the wedding ring says, "Always." It is worn almost to nothing, that word. But it did turn out to be true, just not about him. Always, as it happened, was about her, about me, about the woman who got up off the kitchen floor and decided that her name, her intelligence, and her legal identity had always been worth more than she had been told. Now I am asking you something. Where are you listening to this from? What city? What room? What stage of your own story? And I want to know, if you had been sitting across that table in that restaurant booth, documents in front of you, 47 journalists outside in the cold, what would you have said? I want to know what you would have done with that pen. If this story reached something in you, something you needed to hear today, tell someone who needs it. Share it. Leave it in the comments. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, consider this your invitation. Because every week, there is another story here of a woman who got up off the floor and decided that enough was enough. You should be here for all of them. I will see you in the next one.